The Castle of Whispers, 800 Years of Medieval Shadows. Welcome, dear traveler, to dark medieval whispers from the past, your refuge from the hurried world, your gateway to centuries long silenced. Tonight, we journey together to a place where time itself seems suspended, where 800 years of human memory rests within cold stone walls. This is the Castle of Whispers, 800 Years of Medieval Shadows. Settle yourself comfortably. Let the tensions of your day drift away like morning mist from ancient battlements. Whether you seek the gentle embrace of sleep, the quiet companionship of a long drive, or simply a few hours of peaceful escape, we are here to guide you into a slower, softer world. The medieval past awaits, not with violence or sudden fright, but with the calm melancholy of lives long lived and gently remembered. Breathe deeply. Close your eyes if you wish. Let us begin. Part 1. The Foundations of Memory. In the year of our Lord 1147, in a region of rolling hills where morning fog gathered thick as wool between the valleys, men began to raise a castle from the living earth. The site had been chosen with care by the local lord, a man whose name has faded into the centuries, but whose vision would outlast empires. He selected a rocky outcrop that commanded the river valley below, where merchants traveled and farmers tended their strips of land in the great common fields. From this height, one could see for miles in every direction when the weather permitted, though more often the world was wrapped in gray dampness that muffled sound and obscured all but the nearest trees. The first workers to arrive were surveyors and engineers, men who had learned their craft on monastery construction sites and the repair of ancient Roman roads. They walked the hilltop in the early spring, when snowmelt still trickled between the rocks and the earth smelled of thaw and possibility. They drove stakes into the ground and stretched cords between them, marking out the dimensions of what would become the keep, the great tower that would rise 4 stories above the hill. They calculated the angle of walls and the depth of foundations, knowing that stone is only as strong as the earth that holds it. They studied the rock beneath, testing its strength, planning where to quarry and where to build. As spring turned to summer, the quarrymen arrived. These were hard men with harder hands, who spent their days splitting stone from the hillside with iron wedges and wooden mallets. The sound of their labor echoed across the valley, the sharp crack of iron on stone, the deep thud of splitting rock, the scrape of wooden sledges being dragged across bare earth. They worked from dawn until dusk, their faces gray with stone dust, their backs bent with effort. Each block they freed from the earth weighed more than several men combined, and moving them required coordination, patience, and strength that would seem superhuman to softer ages. The stonemasons came next, craftsmen who had trained since boyhood in the shaping of rock. They arrived with their tools wrapped in oiled leather, chisels of various sizes, mallets of seasoned wood, measuring devices, plumb lines, and levels. These men were proud of their skills, members of guilds with secrets passed from master to apprentice across generations. They could read stone like others read parchment, understanding which blocks would bear weight and which would crack under pressure, which faces should be exposed to weather and which should be sheltered within walls. The sound of their work became the heartbeat of the construction site. All through the long summer days, the steady tapping of metal on stone created a rhythm that never ceased. Each mason had his own tempo, his own style, yet together they formed a symphony of patient labor. They shaped rough, quarried blocks into precise rectangles, trimmed them to fit together with minimal mortar, carved decorative elements for doorways and windows. Their hands grew calloused and scarred, their lungs filled with stone dust that would follow them all their days. But they took pride in their work. They were building something that would outlast them by centuries. The laborers who mixed mortar and carried materials numbered in the dozens during the peak building seasons. These were local men, farmers who worked the construction site when their fields did not demand their presence, earning coins that might mean the difference between hunger and sufficiency for their families. They hauled water from the river, mixed lime and sand into mortar, built wooden scaffolding that climbed higher each month as the walls rose. They operated the great wooden cranes that lifted stone blocks into place, multiple men walking inside enormous wheels like human hamsters, their weight turning the machinery that raised impossibly heavy loads. Among these workers were boys, some as young as 10 or 12, who fetched tools and carried messages, who learned by watching and would eventually become craftsmen themselves if they survived the dangers of construction work. They scrambled up ladders with leather buckets, cleared away stone chips and debris, brought ale and bread to the workers during brief rest periods. Some would fall from scaffolding, or be crushed by shifting stones, or simply waste away from the lung sicknesses that plagued those who breathed rock dust day after day. But others would grow strong, would learn the mysteries of stone and mortar, would one day carve their own marks into the buildings of their maturity. The foundations were dug deep into the hillside, deeper than a tall man stood, until they reached bedrock that would not shift or settle. Into these excavations the builders poured rubble and mortar, creating a base that would support the immense weight of stone walls 30 feet high and 8 feet thick. The foundations took an entire summer to complete, and by autumn, when the work stopped for winter, all that showed for months of labor was a barely visible outline of what would eventually rise. During that first winter, the partially completed work stood exposed to wind and rain and freezing temperatures. Ice formed in the mortar joints, and some blocks cracked from the expansion. When the workers returned in spring, they had to remove damaged stones and begin again in places. This cycle would repeat year after year, for the castle would take nearly 2 decades to complete. Generation would pass to generation among the workers. Boys who began as apprentices would become journeymen and then masters before the final stone was set in place. The keep rose slowly, one course of stones at a time. First, the walls of the ground floor, massively thick, containing storage chambers and a well that reached down to groundwater far below. This level was built without windows, for it needed to be defensible if enemies breached the outer defenses. The only light came from the entrance and from narrow slits too small for a man to pass through, but sufficient for ventilation. The walls were lined with stone shelves where barrels of grain and salted meat would eventually rest, provisions against siege or famine. Above the storage level came the great hall, the heart of the castle, where the lord would hold court and feast with his retainers. Here the builders incorporated larger windows, still narrow by later standards, but sufficient to admit light during the day. These windows were set deep into the thick walls, creating recesses where one could sit and look out over the valley. The floor was laid with stone flags, each piece carefully fitted to its neighbors. The ceiling was vaulted, requiring wooden forms called sintering to support the stones until the mortar cured and the arch could stand on its own. This work required mathematical precision and nerve, for if the sintering was removed too soon, the entire vault could collapse, killing anyone below and destroying months of work. The Great Hall received special attention from the master mason. He carved the corbels that supported the roof beams with faces, some human, some grotesque, some animal. These carvings were his signature, his gift to posterity, expressions of creativity within the rigid demands of structural necessity. He carved a dog with a bone, a monk with a book, a demon with a grin, a woman with flowing hair. Each took days to complete, and each would watch over the hall for centuries after his death. Above the great hall came the Lord's private chambers, smaller rooms with fireplaces built into the thickness of the walls. These fireplaces required special skill to construct, for the flues had to draw properly, carrying smoke up through the stone to chimneys that projected above the roof. A poorly designed flue would fill the chambers with smoke, making them uninhabitable. The master mason spent weeks planning these passages, calculating angles, and ensuring that rain would not pour down the chimneys to extinguish the fires below. The topmost level of the keep was reserved for defense. Here the walls were crenellated, creating alternating high and low sections that would allow defenders to shoot arrows or pour boiling liquid on attackers while remaining protected. A wooden roof covered the platform, supported by sturdy beams that could bear the weight of men running across the structure during battle. From this height, the entire valley spread below like a map. On clear days, one could see other fortifications in the distance, a network of noble strongholds marking out the territories and allegiances of the realm. While the keep rose toward the sky, other structures were being built around its base. Curtain walls extended outward, enclosing a courtyard where daily life would unfold. These walls were lower than the keep, but still formidable, 20 feet high and topped with a walkway where guards could patrol. Towers punctuated the walls at intervals, providing platforms for archers and places where the wall could be defended even if a section was breached. Each tower required its own foundation, its own careful construction, its own internal stairways spiraling upward in darkness. A gatehouse began to take shape, the most vulnerable and therefore most heavily defended point in the fortifications. This structure would have murder holes in the ceiling through which defenders could attack anyone who broke through the outer gate, and a second gate beyond, creating a killing zone for intruders. The gates themselves would be massive oak planks bound with iron, hung on hinges so large and heavy that it took a blacksmith weeks to forge each one. Behind the gates, a portcullis would add another layer of defense, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped quickly to seal the entrance. The castle required a chapel, for the souls of its inhabitants needed tending as surely as their bodies needed feeding. This was built against the inner wall of the courtyard, a small stone structure with a single nave and an apse containing an altar. The chapel received some of the finest craftsmanship, for it housed the presence of God. The mason carved the doorway with elaborate designs, intertwined vines, and geometric patterns that spoke of eternity and divine order. Inside, the altar stone was consecrated by a bishop, making the space holy, transforming it from mere architecture into sacred ground. A local artist painted frescoes on the plaster walls, images of saints and biblical scenes rendered in earth pigments that would fade over the centuries, but never entirely disappear. Stables and workshops rose along the courtyard's edges. The blacksmith's forge was placed carefully, far enough from other structures that flying sparks would not ignite thatched roofs. The stables were built to house dozens of horses, for a lord needed mounts for himself and his knights, as well as work horses for agriculture and transport. The smell of hay and horse and manure would become part of the castle's permanent atmosphere, mingling with wood smoke and cooking food, and the ever-present dampness of stone. A kitchen was constructed as a separate building, for the danger of fire was too great to place it within the keep itself. This building had its own massive fireplace where entire animals could be roasted on spits turned by boys whose faces grew permanently reddened from the heat. Stone ovens built into the walls allowed the baking of bread, and work tables stretched across the space where servants would chop vegetables, pluck fowl, prepare the endless meals required to feed the castle's inhabitants. In times of siege, this building would be vulnerable, but in times of peace it served well enough, and food could be carried across the courtyard to the great hall without cooling too much. Wells were dug at several locations, for water was life, and a castle without its own water source could not withstand siege. The diggers went deep, sometimes 60 feet or more, breaking through layers of clay and rock until they reached the underground streams that flowed unseen beneath the hills. These wells were lined with stone and covered with wooden lids to prevent contamination. Chains and buckets allowed the drawing of water, a task that occupied servants for hours each day, for the castle's needs were great. As the years passed and the construction continued, the site became a small community unto itself. Workers lived in temporary shelters around the base of the hill, rough structures of wood and thatch that they called home during the building seasons. Children were born and raised in the shadow of rising walls. Marriages took place, and deaths, and all the ordinary drama of human existence unfolded against the extraordinary backdrop of creation. The castle became part of the landscape gradually, stone by stone, until it seemed as though it had always been there, as though the hill had always worn this crown of human ambition. The Lord who commissioned the work visited regularly, riding up the muddy track with his retinue, inspecting progress, paying wages, making decisions about design elements. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, though he was capable of great violence when he judged it necessary. He understood that the castle represented not just military power, but also prestige, legacy, a mark that he had existed and mattered. He wanted it to be impressive, but also practical, beautiful, but also functional. He consulted with his master mason frequently, and together they made choices that would affect the structure's character for all its days. As the castle neared completion, craftsmen arrived to add finishing touches. Glaziers installed thin, wavery glass in some of the windows, a luxury that spoke of wealth and status. Carpenters built shutters and doors, tables and benches, all the wooden furnishings needed for habitation. Painters applied whitewash to interior walls, brightening spaces that otherwise would remain in perpetual gloom. Tapestries were commissioned from weavers, depicting hunting scenes and biblical stories, serving both decorative and insulating purposes. These would hang on the stone walls of the great hall, adding color and helping to trap warmth from the fires. The day came at last when the castle was declared complete. This was not a single moment, but rather a gradual realization that all essential work had been finished. The Lord and his household moved in, bringing furniture and supplies, servants and animals, all the paraphernalia of noble life. The construction workers departed, some moving on to other building sites, some returning to their farms, some remaining in the service of the Lord in other capacities. The scaffolding came down, revealing the full form of what had been built. The wooden cranes were disassembled. The piles of stone and sand and tools slowly disappeared. The castle stood complete, its gray walls rising against the sky, its towers watching over the valley, its gates ready to close against enemies. its hearths ready to warm the cold nights ahead. It was a thing of beauty and practicality, of strength and vulnerability, of human ambition frozen in stone. It represented thousands of days of labor, countless injuries and setbacks, years of weather and wear. It was, in its way, a miracle, the transformation of raw earth into ordered structure, the imposition of human will upon the chaos of nature. But even as the completion was celebrated with feasting and ceremony, even as the bishop blessed the finished work and prayers of thanksgiving rose to heaven, the castle began its long transformation from new construction to ancient monument. The first winter rains stained the fresh mortar. The first winds tested the wooden shutters. The first fires blackened the ceilings with soot. The processes of aging and weathering commenced immediately and would never stop, turning the pristine walls gradually darker, softening the sharp edges of carved stone, filling the courtyards with the accumulated debris of daily life. The people who came to live in the castle brought their hopes and fears, their joys and sorrows, their births and deaths. They inhabited the spaces that had been created for them, warming the cold stones with their bodies and their fires, filling the echoing chambers with conversation and argument, laughter and weeping. They made the castle alive, and in return the castle shaped their lives, determined where they slept and worked, whom they saw and when, how they moved through their days. The building and its inhabitants entered into a relationship that would span centuries, each changing the other in ways both obvious and subtle. In the great hall, the Lord held his first feast. His knights and retainers gathered around long tables, the light of torches and fire dancing on the newly carved stone. Serving girls moved among the tables with pitchers of ale and platters of roasted meat. Musicians played in the gallery, the hall filled with the sounds of celebration, of human voices raised in boisterous communion. This scene would repeat thousands of times over the centuries ahead, with different faces but similar patterns, the castle fulfilling the purpose for which it had been created, providing shelter, demonstrating power, gathering community. In the chapel, a priest celebrated the first Mass, his Latin words floating up to the painted ceiling, mingling with incense smoke in the dim candlelight. A handful of worshippers knelt on the cold floor, their prayers ascending like the smoke, hopes for protection and prosperity, pleas for forgiveness and grace. The chapel would see countless prayers in the years ahead, desperate prayers in times of war and plague, grateful prayers in times of peace and plenty, the steady background murmur of humanity reaching toward the divine. In the Lord's chamber, his lady sat by the window, looking out over the valley that was now their domain. She was young, married to a man twice her age in an arrangement negotiated between families, and she was far from the home where she had been raised. The stone walls felt cold and foreign to her, and she wondered if she would ever feel at home in this place. But she was resourceful and intelligent, and she would make her peace with the castle, would learn its rhythms and routines, would eventually become its mistress in deed as well as title. She would bear children in these chambers, would nurse them through fevers and accidents, would watch some grow to adulthood and bury others in the churchyard beyond the walls. The castle would witness all her private moments, her tears in the night, her quiet prayers, her stolen moments of happiness. In the guard's tower, a young soldier stood watch, his spear leaning against the stone, his eyes scanning the darkening valley below. This was his first posting, and he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He would spend long, cold nights on these walls, fighting sleep, marking the slow passage of hours by the stars wheeling overhead. He would grow old in the castle's service, would become grizzled and experienced, would train younger men to stand watch as he had been trained. And eventually he would die, perhaps in battle, perhaps in his bed, and another young man would take his place on the walls, continuing the eternal vigil. The castle settled into its existence, stone and mortar finding equilibrium, wooden beams creaking as they cured and aged, the entire structure adjusting to its own weight and the pressures of wind and weather. In the darkness, in the quiet hours before dawn, it made small sounds, a shift of settling stone, a whisper of draft through corridors, the drip of moisture in deep places. These were the sounds of a living building, breathing and moving in ways too subtle for human senses to fully perceive. And so the castle began its long watch over the valley, a sentinel raised by human hands, but destined to outlast those who built it by many generations. Within its walls, the drama of life would unfold, births and deaths, marriages and funerals, feasts and famines, victories and defeats. The stones would absorb it all, would hold the memories of joy and suffering, would become saturated with human experience until they could tell stories of their own to those who knew how to listen. The 12th century gave way to the 13th, and the castle remained, its purpose unchanged even as the people who inhabited it came and went like mayflies. The original lord died and was succeeded by his son, and then his grandson, and the generations flowed on. The world beyond the castle walls changed slowly. Borders shifted, kings rose and fell, wars were fought and ended. But for those who lived in the valley, the castle was a constant, marking the passage of time even as it seemed to exist outside of time itself. Part 2. The accumulation of shadows. As the 13th century unfolded, the castle had already begun to accumulate its collection of shadows, those residual energies that would eventually give it its reputation for haunting. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like layers of paint applied so slowly that the change is invisible from one day to the next, yet unmistakable when decades are compared. The first death within the castle walls occurred during the initial years of habitation, when a serving girl fell from the upper floor of the keep. Her name was Marjorie, and she was perhaps 14 years old, the daughter of a farmer from the valley who had sent her to the castle in hopes of securing her future. She had been carrying linens from the laundry when her foot caught on the edge of a step worn smooth by countless passages. She fell backward, tumbling down the spiral staircase, her cries echoing off the stone walls until they ceased with terrible abruptness. They found her at the bottom, her neck broken, her eyes still open in surprise. The household grieved in the manner of the time, which is to say they paused in their work long enough to cross themselves and murmur prayers, and then they continued with life because life demanded continuation. Marjorie was buried in the churchyard beyond the walls, and another girl was brought from the village to take her place. But the servants began to say that sometimes, late at night, they could hear the sound of someone falling down those stairs, the terrible thumping cascade followed by silence. They said that if you passed the place where she died at certain hours, you would feel a coldness that had nothing to do with drafts, and sometimes a faint smell of lavender, which had been Marjorie's particular scent from the soap she used. Whether these reports were true or merely the product of fearful imaginations, they became part of the castle's story. And once one ghost was established, others followed more easily, as though the castle had been given permission to hold onto its dead in spectral form. The lord who built the castle died in his bed after a long illness, his lungs slowly filling with fluid until he drowned in himself. This was before physicians understood such things, and all they could do was make him comfortable and pray. His death was quiet, dignified, attended by his family and his priest. But in the years that followed, servants reported seeing a figure in the Lord's old chambers, standing by the window where he had spent so many hours in his final months, looking out over the valley he had ruled. The figure was said to be translucent, visible for only a moment before fading away, and those who saw it reported feeling not fear, but a profound sadness, as though the old lord was reluctant to leave the place he had created. His son, who inherited the castle and the title, was a harder man, more given to violence and less to contemplation. He expanded the castle's defenses, adding an outer wall and more towers, for these were troubled times and the kingdom was racked with civil war. He rode to battle frequently, leading his knights in service to his king, and he brought home prisoners whom he locked in the dungeon beneath the keep. These prisoners suffered terribly in the darkness and cold, some dying there, their bodies thrown into unmarked graves beyond the walls. The dungeon gained a reputation as a place of anguish, and later generations would claim to hear the rattling of chains and the moans of suffering echoing from those deep chambers even when they stood empty. One prisoner in particular left his mark on the castle's psychic fabric. He was a knight captured in battle, a man of honor who had fought for the losing side. The Lord offered him freedom in exchange for switching his allegiance, but the knight refused, bound by oaths he would not break even to save his life. The Lord, angered by this refusal, left him to rot in the dungeon. Months passed, and the knight slowly starved, his prayers growing weaker until finally he fell silent. When they finally went down to check on him, they found he had scratched prayers into the stone walls with his fingernails, worn to bleeding stumps. They buried him without ceremony, but the servants said that his spirit could not rest, that sometimes you could hear him reciting prayers in Latin from the empty dungeon, the words echoing up through the stones. The castle saw its first siege during this period, when rival nobles brought an army to the gates. The siege lasted 3 months, through a brutal winter. Inside the walls, provisions ran low and sickness spread. Outside, the besiegers suffered even worse from exposure and disease. Finally, relief forces arrived and the siege was broken, but not before dozens had died on both sides. The bodies of the besiegers were left where they fell for weeks before being buried in mass graves. The defenders who died were laid to rest in the churchyard, though space was running short and graves had to be dug close together, one generation disturbing the bones of previous generations. During the siege, a young woman gave birth in the keep, the wife of one of the knights. The child was stillborn, strangled by its own umbilical cord, and the mother died soon after from bleeding that could not be stopped. The double tragedy cast a pall over the castle even in the midst of the larger crisis. The knight who lost his wife and child went mad with grief, throwing himself from the walls days after the siege ended. They buried him apart from the others, for suicide was a grave sin, and he could not rest in consecrated ground. But people said that sometimes, on the anniversary of those deaths, you could hear a woman crying in the upper chambers, and the cry of an infant that could not be soothed. The 14th century brought the Great Plague, that terrible scythe that cut down rich and poor alike. It reached the valley in the summer, carried by a merchant who collapsed in the village marketplace, his body covered in dark swellings that meant certain death. Within weeks, half the village was dead or dying. The castle tried to seal itself off, refusing entry to anyone from below, but the plague found its way inside nonetheless, perhaps carried by fleas on the dogs, perhaps by some other means that medieval minds could not comprehend. The plague moved through the castle with terrible efficiency. It began with the servants, those who lived in the most crowded conditions, and then spread to the soldiers, to the Lord's family, to everyone regardless of station. The symptoms were horrific: fever and chills, vomiting and delirium, and the characteristic buboes that swelled in the armpits and groin before finally bursting. The sick were isolated in one of the towers, cared for by a few brave souls who accepted that they were probably condemning themselves to the same fate. Most died within days of showing symptoms. Some recovered, though they were often left weakened or disfigured. The castle's priest worked tirelessly, moving between the dying to offer last rites and comfort, hearing confessions and administering the sacraments. He survived the initial wave of plague only to succumb during the second outbreak a year later. They found him dead in the chapel, kneeling before the altar as though in prayer, though he had actually been dead for hours before anyone discovered him. The chapel thereafter was said to be the most haunted place in the castle, filled with the presences of those who had prayed desperately for salvation that did not come. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, for the grave diggers themselves were dying. Eventually, they began burning the corpses in mass pyres outside the walls, the smoke rising day and night for weeks, the smell permeating everything. The survivors, when the plague finally burned itself out, were traumatized beyond measure. They had watched friends and family die in agony, had lived in constant terror of developing the first symptoms themselves, had seen the dead piled like cordwood. The psychological scars ran deep, and the castle itself seemed to absorb that trauma, to hold on to it in its stones. In the aftermath, the castle was depopulated, its halls echoing with emptiness. The Lord and most of his family had died. The survivors included a younger son who had been away during the plague, visiting relatives in a distant province. He returned to find his inheritance transformed into a charnel house. He was only 17, suddenly lord of a castle and lands that seemed cursed. He set about rebuilding the household, bringing in new servants from villages that had been less affected, trying to restore some semblance of normal life. But he was changed by what he found, haunted by the knowledge of what had happened in his absence, and he became withdrawn and melancholy. This young lord developed a fascination with death and the afterlife. He would spend hours in the chapel, questioning the priest about what happened to souls after death, whether those who died in plague were granted salvation, whether the dead truly departed or lingered near the places they had known. He commissioned a series of frescoes on the chapel walls depicting the dance of death, that medieval artistic motif showing death leading people of all stations, kings and beggars, bishops and peasants, in an eternal dance. The paintings were beautifully executed but deeply unsettling, and they remain on the chapel walls to this day, faded but still visible, still reminding viewers of mortality's inevitability. The young lord never married, never produced heirs. He died young himself, in his early 30s, from an illness that might have been consumption or might have been simply a giving up, a surrender to melancholy. With his death, the direct line ended, and the castle passed to a cousin who had little interest in it, preferring his holdings elsewhere. The castle entered a period of neglect, maintained by only a skeleton staff, its glory days seemingly over. But buildings have their own persistence, and the castle endured. The curtain walls stood firm. The keep remained sound. Rain leaked through the roof in places, and some of the outbuildings fell into disrepair, but the essential structure remained intact. And the ghosts, if ghosts they were, remained as well, more numerous now, their stories multiplying with each passing generation. A new lord eventually took interest in the castle, seeing its strategic value and its potential to be restored. He was a practical man, a soldier who had made his fortune in foreign wars. He dismissed talk of hauntings as peasant superstition, but even he, hardened by years of battle, had experiences that gave him pause. He woke one night to find a pale figure standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with empty eyes. When he reached for his sword, the figure vanished. He told himself it was a dream, but the encounter troubled him enough that he moved his sleeping chamber to a different room. His wife was more sensitive to the castle's atmosphere. She felt presences constantly, a sense of being watched, of not being alone even in rooms she knew to be empty. She heard whispers in corridors, saw movements from the corner of her eye that resolved into nothing when she turned to look. The servants confided in her, telling stories accumulated over decades, of the white lady who walked the battlements at midnight, of the monk who was never there when you looked directly at him, of the sound of a feast in the great hall when the hall stood dark and empty, of cold spots that never warmed no matter how large the fire, of doors that opened on their own and candles that gutted out without wind. The lady began keeping a journal, recording the strange occurrences. She did this partly from curiosity, partly from a desire to understand, and partly as a way of coping with the fear that sometimes gripped her. She wrote down dates and times, descriptions of what people reported seeing or hearing, trying to find patterns that might explain the phenomena rationally. But no pattern emerged beyond the simple fact that the castle seemed to be saturated with more than just memory, seemed to be home to presences that interacted with the living in subtle ways. Her journal survived her and was discovered centuries later in a forgotten chest in the archives. Modern readers found it fascinating, this first-hand account of paranormal experiences written in elegant medieval script. But they also found it sad, for the lady's entries grew increasingly troubled toward the end. She wrote of feeling unwelcome, of sensing hostility from invisible inhabitants who resented the living's presence in their domain. She wrote of nightmares that felt more like visitations, of waking to find phantom hands touching her, of voices calling her name from empty rooms. She died young, in childbirth, both she and the infant lost despite the midwife's best efforts. They buried her in the churchyard, and her grieving husband commissioned a beautiful tomb effigy showing her in prayer, her hands folded peacefully over her breast. But the servants said that she did not rest peacefully, that she joined the castle's other ghosts, and that sometimes she could be seen in the chamber where she died, forever reliving those final agonizing hours. The centuries continued their procession. The 15th gave way to the 16th, and the castle saw wars and peacetimes, prosperity and poverty, joy and suffering in the usual human proportions. Babies were born and old people died. Lovers met in secret and were discovered or not discovered. Servants worked and complained and died. The stones endured, absorbing it all, holding memories like water held in ancient cisterns, deep and still and dark. A terrible murder occurred in the early 16th century. The lord of that time discovered his wife in the embrace of one of his knights. Rage consumed him, and he killed them both on the spot. running the night through with his sword and strangling his wife with his own hands. Afterward, tormented by what he had done, he locked himself in his chamber and refused to eat or drink. He died after a week, probably mad, calling out to his dead wife and begging forgiveness. The three bodies were buried separately, the knight in an unmarked grave, the wife in consecrated ground but away from the family tombs, the Lord with his ancestors despite his sins. The chamber where the murder took place was sealed for generations afterward, for no one would enter it willingly. The servants said you could still hear the sounds of that night, the crash of furniture, the woman's scream, the rattle of the dying night. And sometimes, they said, you could see bloodstains on the floor that appeared and disappeared, never washing away because the blood was not physical but spiritual. The castle accumulated these stories, each adding to its reputation until its fame or infamy spread across the region and beyond. Travelers going past would cross themselves and hurry on. Local people avoided the hill after dark. Only those who had no choice lived within those walls, bound by duty or poverty or both. The castle's lords came and went, but few stayed long, and fewer still died of old age. Some said the place was cursed, that anyone who possessed it was doomed to tragedy. Others said it was simply unlucky, built on a site that had been sacred to older gods before Christianity, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. And through it all, through centuries of stories and deaths and hauntings, the castle stood. Its stones weathered and darkened. Its mortar crumbled and was repaired. Its wooden elements rotted and were replaced. But the essential structure remained, and with it the memories, the echoes, the presences. Whatever had been set in motion when the first stones were laid continued its slow unfolding, year by year, generation by generation, like a story being told in such slow motion that no single lifetime could comprehend its arc. Part 3. Echoes across the centuries. As the medieval period gave way to early modern times, the castle began its transformation from active fortress to historical curiosity. The changing nature of warfare, the development of gunpowder and cannons, made its high stone walls less defensible than they had once been. The focus of power shifted to lowland palaces and urban centers. The castle, once vital to the region's security and governance, became increasingly peripheral, maintained more from tradition and pride than from practical necessity. The 17th century brought religious wars that swept across the land, conflicts where Protestant and Catholic armies burned villages and massacred populations in the name of competing visions of God. The castle, depending on which lord held it at any given time, served alternately as a Catholic stronghold and a Protestant refuge. It changed hands multiple times, sometimes through siege, sometimes through betrayal, once through purchase when a war-weary lord simply sold it to the highest bidder and retired to a monastery to spend his remaining years in prayer. Each change of hands brought violence and suffering. Soldiers died on the walls. Civilians who sought shelter within were sometimes massacred when the gates were breached. The chapel was desecrated repeatedly, its altar overturned by Protestant soldiers who considered it idolatrous, later restored by Catholic forces, then vandalized again. The religious imagery that had adorned it for centuries was destroyed, hammered to rubble, or burned. New images were installed, then removed, then replaced again, until the chapel walls bore scars from all these competing visions of the divine. During one particularly brutal siege, the defenders ran out of food and began eating the horses, then the dogs, than rats. When the castle finally fell, the attackers found emaciated defenders too weak to resist and chose mercy over slaughter more from exhaustion than from compassion. The survivors were allowed to leave, stumbling out through the gates as walking skeletons, their ordeal written in their hollow eyes and sunken cheeks. Many died in the days following their liberation, their bodies too damaged by starvation to recover even when food became available. The castle bore witness to all this suffering, and it added to the accumulation of traumatic memory already pressed into its stones. The great hall, which had seen so many feasts, now more often stood empty except for the wind that howled through broken windows. The chambers where lords and ladies had slept in relative comfort now housed soldiers who drank and gambled and fought among themselves. The chapel, once a place of solemn devotion, became a stable for horses during one occupation, their dung piling on the floor where congregations had knelt. By the late 17th century, the religious wars had ended in exhausted stalemate. The castle found itself in the hands of a merchant family who had grown wealthy from trade and purchased noble titles. These new owners had no military background, no history of governance. They viewed the castle as a status symbol, proof of their arrival among the elite. They attempted to modernize it, adding elements of comfort and style that clashed with the austere medieval architecture. They installed glass windows in place of wooden shutters, hung expensive tapestries over the cold stone, brought in furniture from fashionable cabinet makers. But they never felt comfortable there. The wife complained constantly of the cold and damp, of the isolation, of the oppressive atmosphere that no amount of decoration could lighten. The husband found the management of the lands attached to the castle more burdensome than he had anticipated. The local peasants regarded them with suspicion, these outsiders who had bought their way into positions that others inherited by blood. Within a decade, the family sold the property and returned to the city, relieved to leave. The 18th century saw the castle fall into serious decline. Several owners in succession found it too expensive to maintain, too uncomfortable to inhabit, and too historically significant to demolish. It stood increasingly empty, visited occasionally by the landowning families who held title to it but lived elsewhere. The roofs began to fail, letting in rain that damaged wooden beams and accelerated decay. Parts of the curtain wall collapsed where foundations had been undermined by water. The outbuildings became homes for owls and bats, their floors covered with centuries of accumulated droppings. Local people pilfered stones from the castle for their own building projects, a slow dismantling that no one prevented because no one was there to stop it. The fine carved stones from doorways and windows ended up incorporated into farm cottages and village churches. Iron fittings were removed and melted down for other uses. Wooden beams were salvaged for firewood or construction. The castle was being consumed by the very populace it had once dominated, recycled into humbler structures that served more practical purposes. Yet, even in decay, even as it crumbled, the castle maintained its reputation for haunting. If anything, the stories grew more elaborate as the building grew more ruinous. With fewer living inhabitants to contradict the tales, imagination had freer rein. Travelers claimed to see lights in the windows of the keep when no one was there, ghostly torches processing along the walls, sounds of battle echoing from the courtyard. Young people dared each other to spend a night within the ruins, and most who attempted it fled before dawn, refusing to explain what they had experienced but adamant that they would never return. The 19th century brought the Romantic movement, with its fascination for ruins and its appetite for Gothic atmosphere. Suddenly, the castle became fashionable again, not as a residence, but as a destination for tourists and artists. Painters came to capture its picturesque decay on canvas. Poets wrote verses celebrating its melancholy grandeur. Amateur historians began documenting its history, interviewing elderly local residents who remembered stories their grandparents had told. The ghost stories were collected and published, becoming part of Gothic literature's canon. A wealthy industrialist purchased the property in the mid-19th century with the intention of restoring it as a romantic retreat. He hired architects and craftsmen, and work began on stabilizing the structures, replacing roofs, repairing walls. But the restoration proved more difficult than anticipated. Workers complained of tools going missing, of feeling watched, of unexplained accidents. One stonemason fell to his death in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. He was experienced, working on a scaffold that showed no signs of failure, yet he simply fell, and his fellow workers swore they heard him scream something about hands pushing him, though no one else was near when it happened. The industrialist's wife refused to live in the castle after spending just one night there. She reported being unable to sleep due to constant noises, footsteps in corridors, voices in empty rooms, the sound of a child crying that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When dawn came, she packed her belongings and left, telling her husband he could keep the castle, but she would not set foot in it again. He divided his time between the castle and their city residence, but even he found the place increasingly oppressive. The restoration was never completed to the level he had envisioned, and when he died, his heirs sold the property as quickly as they could. The 20th century saw the castle pass through multiple ownerships, each attempting something different. For a time it housed a school, though the students and teachers reported so many disturbing experiences that enrollment dwindled and the school closed. It briefly became a sanatorium for tubercular patients. The isolation and fresh air thought to be beneficial, but the patients complained of nightmares, and some claimed the castle was making them worse rather than better. During the World Wars, it served as a storage facility and briefly as a barracks, but even military men found it unsettling, and it was never used for frontline troops because morale suffered among those stationed there. Archaeologists and paranormal researchers began taking interest in the castle, conducting digs and investigations. The archaeologists uncovered fascinating artifacts, medieval pottery, corroded weapons, coins spanning 8 centuries, the remains of buildings that had long since collapsed. The paranormal investigators brought their equipment, cameras and recording devices and electromagnetic field detectors, and claimed to capture evidence of the supernatural. Whether their findings represented genuine phenomena or wishful thinking interpreted through technological means remained debatable, but their work added to the castle's fame as one of the most haunted sites in the region. In the latter part of the century, the castle was acquired by a heritage trust dedicated to preserving historic structures. They undertook careful conservation work, stabilizing what remained, preventing further decay without attempting to restore it to any particular historical appearance. They opened it to the public, offering guided tours and educational programs. Signs were erected explaining the castle's history, its architecture, its role in regional development. The ghost stories were acknowledged but presented as folklore rather than fact, interesting cultural artifacts in their own right. Yet the phenomena continued, reported by staff and visitors alike. Guards who worked night shifts told of seeing figures in medieval dress, of doors opening and closing, of sudden temperature drops. Visitors captured photographs that appeared to show anomalies, mists in human form, faces in windows, shadows where no shadows should be. Most had rational explanations, but a few defied easy dismissal. The staff developed an unspoken policy of respecting the castle's atmosphere, of treating the building with a certain reverence, as though acknowledging that they were guests in a place that belonged to others, to those who had come before and perhaps never left. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the castle stood as it had stood for 800 years, weathered but enduring, changed but recognizable, a palimpsest of history where multiple eras remained simultaneously visible. The medieval keep still dominated the hill. The curtain walls, though crumbled in places, still traced their original circuit. The chapel, though missing its roof, still held its sacred character. The stones that had been quarried in the 12th century still bore the marks of the masons who shaped them. And the ghosts, if ghosts there were, continued their existence, whatever form that existence took. Whether they were residual energy, genuine spirits, psychological projections, or simply stories that had achieved a kind of life through endless retelling, they remained part of the castle's reality. Visitors felt their presence, sensed the weight of accumulated history, experienced the uncanny feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some who visit the castle at night, when the public tours have ended and the site stands quiet, report experiences that transcend simple fear. They speak of a profound sadness that seems to emanate from the stones themselves, as though the castle mourns all that it has witnessed, the suffering and violence, the deaths and departures, the slow procession of human struggle that has unfolded within its walls. They speak of feeling connected to those who came before, of sensing the common thread of human experience that links a medieval servant girl to a 21st century visitor, separated by 8 centuries, yet united in the basic experiences of hope and fear, joy and sorrow. The castle teaches, for those willing to learn, about impermanence and persistence. It shows how human ambitions, which seem so vital and consuming in their moment, fade into triviality when viewed across centuries. The feuds that once seemed worth killing for are now forgotten. The religious divisions that drove men to slaughter each other are now historical curiosities. The social hierarchies that determined who lived in luxury and who died in dungeons have collapsed into dust. Yet the stones remain, and the memories, and the echoes. It teaches about the layers of history, how each age builds upon and incorporates what came before, transforming but never entirely erasing. The medieval castle contains within it the Bronze Age settlement that once occupied the hill. The 16th century modifications contain the 12th century foundations. The 19th century restoration contains the 14th century walls. Nothing is ever truly new, and nothing is ever truly lost. Everything persists in altered form, available to those who know how to read the evidence. It teaches about suffering and endurance, how humans have always faced hardships, have always struggled and persisted, have always found ways to continue despite loss and pain. The medieval peasant hauling stones, the plague victim dying in agony, the soldier standing watch on a frozen wall, the mother grieving her stillborn child. All of them endured their moments of trial, and their endurance is recorded in the castle's stones. We are not so different from them. We who live in comfort they could not imagine. We face our own trials, and we too endure, or fail to endure, and perhaps someday our struggles will seem as remote and incomprehensible to future generations as they seem to us. The castle stands now in the 21st century as a monument to all of this, to ambition and decay, to life and death, to memory and forgetting, to the human story in all its tragedy and triumph. It is allegedly haunted, and whether those hauntings are supernatural or psychological or simply the echoes of 800 years of human experience pressed into stone hardly matters. The castle is haunted by history itself, by the accumulated weight of time, by the undeniable fact that countless lives unfolded within those walls, that people laughed and wept and hoped and feared there, that they were born and died there, that they left traces of their existence that persist even when their names are lost. To walk through the castle today is to walk through a palimpsest of human existence, where medieval and modern overlap, where past and present exist simultaneously. The ghosts are not separate from the history, but are part of it, are perhaps the most vivid way that history makes itself felt. To sense a presence in an empty corridor is to sense the continuation of all that came before, the persistence of human experience beyond the span of individual lives. The castle will continue standing, or will continue crumbling, into whatever future awaits. Perhaps it will be further restored, transformed into a museum or event space or luxury accommodation. Perhaps it will be allowed to decay naturally, returning gradually to the earth from which it was raised. Perhaps something we cannot foresee will befall it. But whatever happens, it will continue to hold its stories, its memories, its ghosts. Because 800 years of human life cannot be erased. It can be forgotten, but it cannot be unmade. It happened, all of it. The construction and the sieges, the feasts and the famines, the births and the deaths, the joy and the suffering. And the stones remember, even if we do not. For those who visit seeking ghosts, the castle offers exactly that. Not perhaps in the form they expect, not as transparent figures floating through walls, but as something more subtle and more powerful. It offers the presence of the past, the tangible sensation that we are not the first to stand in these spaces, that we are part of a story much longer than our individual lives, that we are connected across time to all who came before and all who will come after. That connection, that continuity, is perhaps the true ghost, the persistence of human consciousness, human experience, human story across the centuries. And so the castle stands on its hill, as it has stood for 800 years, dark stones against the sky, empty windows watching the valley below, corridors echoing with footsteps both present and past. The mist gathers around its walls on autumn mornings. The wind howls through its towers on winter nights. The rain darkens its stones in spring. The sun warms them in summer. And through all seasons, through all weather, through all the changes that time brings, it persists, a monument, a mystery, a memorial to all who lived and died within its walls, allegedly haunted since the 12th century. And whether that haunting is literal or metaphorical, it is certainly, undeniably real. And so our journey through 8 centuries comes to its gentle close, dear traveler. We have walked together through the castle's long history, from its first stones to its present silence, from its days of glory to its nights of haunting. We have touched, however briefly, the lives of those who built it and those who died within it, the mighty and the humble, all of them gone now into that darkness from which even ghosts are only dim reflections. The medieval world we have visited tonight is not a place of horror, but of humanity, of struggle and survival, of quiet dignity amid suffering, of moments of peace stolen from lives of hardship. These stones have held all of it, have witnessed the full range of human experience across 800 years. And in witnessing, in remembering, they offer us something precious, a connection to those who came before, a reminder that we are part of a story larger than ourselves. If this journey has brought you rest, if it has carried you towards sleep or provided companionship on your drive through the night, then it has served its purpose. Dark Medieval Whispers from the Past exists to offer these quiet escapes, these meditative wanderings through history's shadows. We invite you to honor this work with your like, to share your reflections in the comments, and to subscribe for more journeys into the darker, gentler spaces of the medieval world. Until we meet again, may your rest be peaceful, your dreams be calm, and your road be safe.